Annie. Thanks for the introduction. I'm delighted to be here. So as Annie said, I'm Nick Brooks. I run a small firm, Garama 3C, based in Norwich, that offers consultancy and training services around climate change. My background, as Annie indicated, is in climate science and adaptation. And recently I've been doing more work around the growing net zero agenda. I should also say that I was born in West Runton and grew up in Sheringham, so I have a special attachment to North Norfolk, and I'm really pleased to be working with colleagues in the council and with the rest of you as well. So I guess the first thing to say, just Annie, am I in control of the slides, or do I need to ask you to move to?
I'll move to the slides for you if you just let me know.
Yeah, I'll let you know. Okay, that's great, thanks. So what I want to do today is to say something about the implications of climate change and the climate crisis for North Norfolk, what this means in terms of how we mitigate climate change, by which we mean reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Mitigation is our sort of technical climate geek speak for reducing our emissions, but also how we adapt to the impacts of climate change. And I want to place this in something of a global context as well. So globally, action on climate change is framed by the Paris Agreement, and this agreement commits the world's governments to limiting warming to no more than 2 degrees Celsius at most, and preferably no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. So collectively, national and sort of corporate net zero commitments are intended to help us achieve these Paris goals of limiting warming below 1.5 to 2 degrees. But we need to acknowledge that despite all the commitments that we're seeing, and lots happening this week, and I'll say a little bit about that too, based on current policies, what governments are actually doing, we're actually heading for a warming somewhere in the region of 3 degrees by the end of the century. If all countries genuinely do deliver on their pledges and targets under the Paris Agreement, we're likely to bring warming below 3 degrees, but still be in excess of the 2-degree threshold. And so there's been a flurry of announcements this week. We've had new commitments from the UK, the US, the EU, and I think other countries as well. But of course, these all sound very ambitious, and they're great to see, but these targets still have to be translated into policies and actions. And it's worth saying that even with the new ambition from the US, that's still not quite compatible with the 1.5 degree Celsius target. So there's a long way to go, and while the intention is there, we're not yet on the pathway that brings us down significantly below 3 degrees. And we really need to step off that pathway. To put this in something of a long-term perspective, a warming of 3 degrees Celsius is at the lower end of the warming that you expect coming out of an ice age into a warm interglacial. And the transition from the peak of the last ice age, around 21,000 years ago, to the warm conditions under which human civilization has flourished, took about 10,000 years. So we're driving really rapid warming, some 50 to 100 times faster than would occur under comparable geological periods of warming. So a world that's 3 degrees warmer would be a very different place. And this amount of warming would mean changes in the availability and distribution worldwide of key resources, principally water, productive and habitable land, in the distribution of species and ecosystems. And of course, it would mean profound changes in local and regional climatic and environmental conditions. And some parts of the world that are currently densely populated would be likely to become effectively uninhabitable. It's not the end of the world, but it is potentially very catastrophic for many parts of the world. So to deliver on the Paris commitments, which we really need to try and do, we need massive and immediate reductions in emissions that we then sustain for decades. And so if I could ask Annie to give me the first slide, please. Great. So we can see the magnitude of challenge in these two graphics here. There's quite a lot going on, but there's a simple message really. On the left, we've got what we might call a family of greenhouse gas emissions pathways from the 2018 IPCC report, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that looked at how we achieve this 1.5 degree target or threshold, keep below 1.5 degrees of warming. And on the right, we have a graphic from last year's emissions gap by the UN Environment Programme. This is an annual report that looks at what the gap is between where we need to be and where we are. And so the blue curve that says current policy scenario is basically the trajectory we're on. And these curves that have a steep decline underneath it, labeled 2 degrees, 1.8 and 1.5, are what needs to happen to emissions in order to keep below those temperature thresholds. So, as I said, there's quite a lot going on. It's quite a busy sort of slide here, but there's one very clear message, and that is that if we want to get onto emissions trajectories globally that are compatible with meeting these Paris targets, and we see where the red arrows are, we need a precipitous drop in global emissions starting around 2020. And for those of us who are paying attention, we'll realize that this was last year. So what this is saying is that we need an immediate massive reduction in emissions that is then sustained again for decades. So this shows us something of the magnitude of the challenge that we have. So we've heard a lot about how emissions have declined during the pandemic. So I think it's worth just saying something about that as well. So if I can ask Annie for the next slide, please. Thanks. So this shows us the impacts of the pandemic on emissions globally throughout 2020. So the graphic here shows how emissions dropped, and the biggest decrease, we can see this big sort of trough around about April, May, was in spring, and the largest contribution to that was a drop in the use of surface transport. But we can see that emissions are already creeping back up again, and they rose quite rapidly after spring 2020. So the latest estimate is that global emissions were reduced by around 6.4% over the course of 2020. In the UK, this was higher, it was around 9%, considering all greenhouse gases, and I think 10.7% if we look at just CO2 alone. And again, most of this reduction was, earlier in the year, I think, and associated with reduced surface transport and travel, commuting, and so on. So to put this fall in perspective, it's around 1% lower than what's needed every year for many decades to keep below the 1.5 degree threshold, the more stringent Paris target. And as we can see here, emissions are already bouncing back, and in China, they're already above pre-pandemic levels. And a recent report by Behavioural Economics, a UK consulting firm, concluded that the stimulus packages of 21 major economies are dominated by what they referred to as potentially damaging contributions based on fossil fuel extraction and combustion. So what it looks like is, notwithstanding the announcements we've heard this week, is the actual trajectory is that we're returning to business as usual and in danger of missing this opportunity to transition to a lower emissions world, a vastly lower emissions world as we come out of the pandemic. So there are two key takeaways from all of this. I think the first is that we need to take some really bold decisions to keep warming as low as possible, as close to these Paris limits and preferably below them as we can. And this is absolutely critical. But I think we also need to recognise, if we're concerned with the impacts of climate change on our area, for example, that there's a good chance that we will breach these Paris thresholds. So we could breach the 1.5 degree limit around about 2030, or that's probably more likely we'll do this in the 2040s, and the 2 degree threshold sometime around mid-century. We still can't rule out a warming of 3 degrees or more. So while we need to do everything we can to stop warming reaching 3 degrees and keep it as low as possible, we also need to be prudently planning for warming in excess of those Paris thresholds. And we need to be thinking about that now. Of course, down the line, if we see things are looking much, much better and all of the targets are being met, then we might rethink that. But we can't rest on our laurels here. So what does all this mean for the UK and for North Norfolk in particular in terms of both adaptation and mitigation? What does responding to climate change mean for planning and for the way that we live our lives? And I think if I can just ask for the next slide, please, Annie. The first thing to say is that on the mitigation side, reducing emissions, the UK has actually been doing pretty well compared to a lot of countries, notwithstanding some of the discussion we had earlier about exporting those emissions to manufacturing countries that are producing the goods that we buy. So on this graph, we've got a left-hand graphic that shows historical emissions, that the sort of the solid black curve, and how they've been declining by about 40% since 1990. It's territorial emissions, so not including exported emissions. And the dotted purple line shows where we need to be going to meet the national net zero target. And this is from the Committee on Climate Change, from a report last year, titled their 6th annual carbon budget. And this is the thing that the government has adopted this week and committed to a reduction by 2035 of 78% in terms of emissions. So that's great. The government has adopted the recommendations broadly of the Climate Change Committee. So this shows where we need to be. And I think it's worth saying that the relative success that we've had in reducing emissions nationally has been really down to the decarbonisation of the energy sector, transition from coal and then to gas and then to renewables. And in a sense, that's the easy stuff. What we've got left to do is a lot of the harder stuff, the more difficult sectors to decarbonise. So there are some significant challenges ahead. So yeah, this 78% target still needs to be turned into policies and actions. And I think, again, worth pointing out that currently we're not even on track to deliver on the less stringent targets in the earlier carbon budget. So again, while the news this week is really, really welcome, there's a long way to go. So the right-hand graphic shows the distribution of emissions across sectors for the UK as a whole. And here we can see that electricity production now makes up around 10% of annual emissions because of the transition to renewables. So there's still a lot of scope for improvement here, but we've done well there. Currently, the biggest single source of emissions in the UK is surface transport, followed closely by industry and then buildings, with agriculture making up around 10%. So, of course, if we produce similar graphics for the local level, this is going to be quite variable across the country, depending on the characteristics of individual counties and local authority areas. I had a quick scan at some figures, for North Norfolk, so I'll say a little bit about that, but I won't present any data because it was very back of the envelope on my part. And certainly, we expect North Norfolk's rural character to influence the distribution of its emissions. We'd probably expect a greater share from agriculture and surface transport, for example. But actually, what appears to be the case from the data that I had a brief look at just a day or so ago is that we've got a lower share from agriculture. Now, I'm not sure whether that's because certain things are included in other sectors. Surface transport for North Norfolk is a little bit higher than nationally. But what was really striking was it seems that we have a massively greater contribution from buildings to the national average. So that goes some way towards setting our priorities here. And Annie might say more about that afterwards. So let's look at some of these sectors, from a North Norfolk perspective. And let's look first at surface transport. This has already been, I think, pointed out in some of the questions. In North Norfolk, we have a high dependence on private vehicle use and ownership. And this has a bearing on how we decarbonise surface transport. So a shift to electric vehicles is certainly going to be necessary, and I think the council is supporting that. It's also worth pointing out that there are some issues around this transition, not specifically related to North Norfolk, but in general. So for a start, electrifying just the UK's vehicle fleet will take a massive amount of resources. And based on existing technologies, it's been estimated that this will require, for the UK alone, around twice the annual global production of cobalt, all of the annual production of certain other rare earth metals, and more than half the world's annual production of copper, just to decarbonise the UK's, or to make that transition to electrify the UK's vehicle fleet. And of course, globally, this is going to be amplified a lot to address, I think, the 2 billion vehicles in the world. And there are concerns that, in the race for these resources, companies are going to start exploring the deep ocean with potential, large-scale ecological devastation in the oceans. So I think looking at the challenges around transition to EVs, electrification of transport, it illustrates one of the challenges around net zero, and one of the key messages, I think, which is that we can't just achieve our net zero ambitions by doing business as usual, but with renewables. We do need much more fundamental transitions, including behaviour change as well as technological change. And once we start looking at changes in behaviour, of course, we come up against questions of fairness and affordability. For example, can everybody afford to transition to an electric vehicle? What sort of behaviour change can and should we expect in a rural context such as North Norfolk, where public transport is a far cry from the mass transit systems that we have in cities? So there are some real sort of key issues here that we need to tackle with. Can we manage planning processes to reduce the need for car journeys? Can we leverage the recent shift to home working to sustain a reduction in commuting? And what can the council do beyond simply supporting an expansion in EV charging points, which is really necessary? That's absolutely essential, but I think we need to think about other things as well. And I think these are the kind of questions we need to be asking and having, open discussions about, as a county, as a community. So domestic buildings are obviously another very, very challenging area. And again, in North Norfolk, they seem to make a much bigger contribution than they do nationally on average. And the main issue here is the need for a shift away from gas boilers and off-grid coal and oil. Actually, yes, coal and oil-based heating. The house I grew up in Sheringham had heating powered by an anthracite boiler, for example. I'm not quite sure how many of those are still around, but certainly in North Norfolk, a lot of people are not on the gas grid. So even though gas is a fossil fuel that we need to move away from, some people are still using more emissions-intensive fuels. So, what can the local authority do to encourage this transition to things like, heat pumps and, potentially even hydrogen-ready gas boilers? So public awareness campaigns are one possible option, but again, we come up against these issues of affordability and fairness. For new developments, we might look at working with developers to encourage things like community and district heating systems, which can be very efficient and very low emissions. But again, what about retrofitting older homes? So some key questions here about, what can be done locally, given the sort of political and finance constraints as well. So of course, agriculture is also a hugely important sector for North Norfolk, and farm emissions come from livestock, from chemical fertilizers, from farm infrastructure, on-farm transport and energy use, the transport and distribution of farm products, farm waste, and emissions from disturbed soils. So there's a whole host of sources there. And there's a question of how much these emissions can be reduced and what role there is, for example, for on-farm carbon sequestration, maybe in combination with rewilding, to try and offset some of those difficult to mitigate emissions. What role is there, for example, for the production of biofuels, given that these might compete with food production, but that they might also be used in, for example, surface transport? It's also worth mentioning the fact that we have the Bacton gas plant here in North Norfolk as well, our own piece of fossil fuel generating infrastructure, and this also needs to be addressed. And I understand there are plans here to shift to hydrogen production, initially from natural gas and ultimately through electrolysis powered by renewables. And so perhaps there's a potential link here with reducing emissions from domestic power and transport. And I think this illustrates the need for a very sort of holistic, joined up thinking across sectors and keep, trying to avoid thinking in sectoral silos. So let's turn to how we adapt to the impacts of climate change in North Norfolk. And the most obvious risk here, which has already been mentioned, is the risk to the coast. And this results from a combination of sea level rise, accelerated erosion, changes in storm behaviour, and associated coastal flood risks. So I've got some maps here which show how climate change is likely to affect flood risk and ultimately the shape of our coastline. So Annie, if you could move to the next one, please, that'd be great. Thank you. So I'll start with this map, which shows areas that are below the highest high tide line experienced over the past 30 years. So these are areas that are currently at risk from flooding under extreme tides. And we see the red areas represent these sort of high flood risk areas under sort of recent historical extremes. So of course we have the Broads, which is very low lying, and then we have the North Norfolk coast. And I think a lot of people here will be familiar with the flooding that occurred in, for example, 2013. And I think again we had some more recently. So we can see sort of a bit of a preview, if you like, of what might be happening under climate change more frequently if we look at these events. So if we could move to the next slide. Thanks. This shows the same thing, but this is instead of looking at areas within 0 meters of the high tide line, it looks at areas within 1 meter of the high tide line, historical high tide line. So this is how that flood risk progresses if we have a sea level rise of about 1 meter, which we expect by the end of the century. Now, of course, this map doesn't account for changes in coastlines from erosion and so on, or changes in storm activity. So it probably underestimates risk. So again, we don't see a massive increase, but we see a sort of nibbling away at the coast, if you like. So that flood risk area comes further inland, particularly in the North Norfolk coast and the Broads. And the next one, please. And this just shows the same thing with a 2 meter sea level rise, which is possible by 2100, but at the high end of current estimates. So again, Norfolk is pretty much still there. But again, we have a sort of incremental but significant increase in the areas exposed to these coastal flood risks. With the next slide, we are looking a little bit further ahead, and this is the risk map for the high-end estimates of sea level rise by 2200. So we won't be around then, but our descendants will. And the high-end estimates for 2200 are around 7.5 meters. So again, you know, Norfolk is still pretty much there, but we can see quite a big increase in the flood risk. And of course, with a sea level rise of a metre or two, we will also be looking at the permanent inundation of some of these coastal areas. And then I think it's worth, you know, recalling that the last time the Earth was 3 degrees warmer, if we do get that far, if we do fail, for example, with all our ambitious mitigation targets, last time this was 3 degrees warmer, sea levels were 20 to 30 meters higher than they are today. So just for fun, I've got another map here, which shows, and we've changed the color because I had to use a different tool, the web tool that I used to do the other maps only went up to 10 meters. So in, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years, if we don't mitigate, then, you know, we can see a Norfolk that looks something like this, under 20 meters of sea level rise. And then if we go to the next one, under 30 meters of sea level rise. So I guess you could look at this one of two ways, that, well, a lot of Norfolk is still there in 1,000 years, even if we perform really badly. Or if you're a pessimist, say, well, a lot of Norfolk isn't. So I think this, you know, while this is maybe not something we need to concern ourselves with in our lifetimes, you know, if we look back at our national and local history, we do look back, you know, 1,000 years or more. So if we are, you know, thinking long term, then let's keep this in mind, that, you know, the decisions we make today, collectively, globally, do, you know, alter the face of the planet for thousands of years to come in the future. So lots riding on this for future generations. So this all raises questions about how we respond to these kinds of risks. To what extent can we continue to protect our existing coastlines under these potentially larger amounts of sea level rise? And at what point do we accept that coastal land is just going to be lost? How do we adapt our coastal planning, zoning, and our existing settlements? And I think a key issue along the North Norfolk coast and in the Broads is how we manage coastal ecosystems in the face of sea level rise. So one option is to help them to migrate inland, to help them try and keep pace with sea level rise. And they might not be able to do this very easily naturally, so they might need some assistance. But this in turn raises questions about what happens when we have this phenomenon of coastal squeeze, when ecosystems are squeezed between an expanding or a shoreline that's coming further inland, and between hard infrastructure, you know, roads and settlements and so on the other side. So I always think of things like the Clyde Marshes here, and you've got the road and the town and the village, and what happens there as the sea levels rise and those coastal ecosystems get squeezed and shrink and shrink? Are they going to disappear? We're going to try and help those to, you know, recreate themselves inland. And I think these are critical questions because there will be some trade-offs there. So we need to think very hard about how we manage these risks in the future if we want to preserve our natural heritage. So climate change will also have profound implications for agriculture in North Norfolk. And as elsewhere, high temperatures and reduced summer rainfall will increase the likelihood and the severity of drought during the growing season. And at the same time as reductions in soil moisture are going to increase water demand. So an increase in the intensity of summer rainfall, even while we might have drought, we could have heavier rainfall, will increase risks of crop damage, and increased climatic variability and unpredictability is going to mean a greater general risk of disruptive extremes. So these might include protracted wet episodes, such as we saw last autumn, unexpected cold extremes, and extended periods of unusually dry or humid conditions. And these might be associated with changes in the prevalence of pests and diseases. And North Norfolk will also face a more general set of risks and adaptation issues. So more frequent and severe heat extremes have implications for health and for natural systems and potentially infrastructure. Drought and waterlogging, followed by heavy rainfall, will increase the risk of flash flooding. And this is likely to be exacerbated by, you know, more severe winter storms, which is something we're already seeing in the UK. And then there's also the possibility of what we call climate surprises. And one example is this possibility of the slowdown or shutdown of the North Atlantic circulation, which is associated with the Gulf Stream that keeps us warm in the cooler months of the year. It makes Western Europe a lot warmer than equivalent latitudes in North America, for example. So about 20 years ago, people were quite concerned about the potential shutdown or severe slowdown of the North Atlantic circulation. And then they stopped worrying about it so much because the models weren't really predicting it and so on. But we've seen some observational evidence recently that this slowdown is occurring. So some people are becoming quite concerned about this again. And if we do see a significant slowdown in the circulation, we could experience much more severe winters, greater cooling. It could offset quite a bit of the regional warming. So colder conditions outside the summer months, certainly. And again, with implications for things like transport, infrastructure, and agriculture. At the moment, I think we're expecting things to get generally warmer, the growing seasons to be extended, but this could reverse all that. And we've had some sort of pretty cold snap sort of late into this spring, and that sort of thing could become much more common. And so more generally, of course, we're also exposed, as is everybody, to the secondary impacts of climate change and climate-related disasters occurring in other parts of the world. So I think increasingly these are going to pose like a risk to supply chains, commodity prices, and political stability. So what are the knock-on effects for us here? And I think to survive in a world that's increasingly beset by climatic disruption, we need to really focus on building resilience at both the national and the local level. And so this means getting the balance right between, for example, self-reliance and reliance on global networks. It's one thing to say, well, we're going to be self-reliant, so we're not affected so much by these things that happen in other parts of the world. But what if we get hit ourselves directly by, the impacts of climate change here? We need to be able to call on assistance from elsewhere. So I think isolationism and pure self-sufficiency isn't the answer. We need some sort of flexibility. So we can rely on local resources and production when we need to, but call on national and international networks and partnerships when we suffer those impacts ourselves. And so I think the other thing we need to do is move away from a reliance on vulnerable supply chains based on the idea of just enough, just in time, because these tend to prioritize economic efficiency, understandably, to reduce costs above everything else, but they do make systems very, very vulnerable to shocks. And we need more resilience in our systems, and that means more redundancy, which is often in tension and a trade-off when it comes to that compared to economic efficiency. So I think there's a lot for local government to contend with, and local authorities need to engage seriously now with decarbonisation and adaptation challenges. And the actions of local government, I think, certainly need to go beyond the decarbonisation of council activities and infrastructure and help support these wider societal transitions. So local authorities need to engage with the wider community, which is what we're doing here. So this isn't a criticism, this is just a further encouragement, really. And that means engaging with business, industry, and the public to drive the necessary transitions to deliver low carbon, resilient societies now. And so, of course, we have to recognise that local authorities only have limited spending and legal powers. So they have to be smart and innovative about how they do this. The most obvious response is to align local plans and policies with national policies that are aimed at delivering net zero and building resilience. But I think local actions do need to go further, A, because national policies might not be adequate, and B, because local areas face their own contextual challenges determined by their sort of local characteristics. So I think one of the key things local authorities need to do is engage constructively with stakeholders to try and promote positive behavioural change and combine this with technological change. And I've got one more slide to show, Annie, please. Thank you. And this is a slide from the Committee on Climate Change report from last year. And it shows the breakdown of net zero actions in terms of those that focus on technical measures alone, which is the, I think, the blue wedge. Those that are principally behavioural in nature, the orange wedge. And those that involve a mix of technology and behavioural change, which is I think the pink stuff. If I can read the slide, yes. Yeah. So what we can see here is that, over 50% of the emissions reductions we want to achieve will involve some form of behavioural change. So again, this is back to the message that it's not just about technology. It's not just business as usual with renewables. So we're not talking about sort of individual carbon footprints alone. We're not just talking about recycling and switching to low energy light bulbs, although that sounds terribly old fashioned now. We have to recognise that behaviour change isn't just about individual consumers, but it's about everybody in society, including decision makers in government, business and industry. And it's about how changes in behaviour in one group may influence changes in another group. So there's quite a lot of complexity here. And this isn't trying to push the responsibility just onto individuals. So a lot of work has highlighted that people tend to act on issues like climate change and the environment when they perceive that there's a risk to something they value and they believe that they have the power to reduce or remove that risk. So it's all very well making people aware of the risks, but they have to have some agency. So we have to try and build that as well, give them the power to do something about it. Otherwise, we're just depressing people. One of the things that they can do is demand action from decision makers. And so this is one aspect of addressing the challenge, greater sort of participation, democracy, if you like, that allows the population of a region to have a greater say in what goes on and put pressure on people who are making decisions that affect the way things are developing. So helping to shift the perceptions of the public around climate change is critical to changing behaviour, but also not just their own behaviour in business and government at all levels, to send the message that people are ready for change and that they even are demanding it. So one thing authorities like NNDC can do is work with researchers and social scientists to identify the factors that, that drive change, the barriers and enabling factors around behavioural change. And of course, another thing we need is vision. And I'm not speaking about this particular context, but just globally, I think we can say that vision and imagination have been sadly lacking in the politics of climate change. It's been very, very sort of unimaginative, I think, in terms of envisaging possible futures. And so we can use scenarios or approaches like scenario planning, not only to identify and address risks from climate change, but also to develop visions of what sort of future we want given the climate change context, and then look at how we can get there. And we actually have a lot of expertise in Norfolk in these areas, a place like UEA, the Tyndall Centre, where I worked many, many years ago. And I think building and strengthening partnerships with these organisations, with researchers and so on, to drive the transitions we need is going to be critical. So I think just to conclude, I'm going to say that North Norfolk may be on the front line of climate change and it faces a lot of challenges. But in many respects, I think we're really well placed to confront the crisis. And that's the task that we need to set ourselves. So I'll stop there and hopefully I didn't take too long to ramble on. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Nick, for your presentation and for your insights. And I'm sure you've provided lots of food for thought for everyone.